The Suzuki TL1000S looked like the perfect superbike. Sleek, powerful, and ready to take on Ducati at half the price. But hidden inside was a flaw so dangerous it earned the bike a deadly reputation. Released in 1997, the TL1000S packed a 996cc V-twin engine that promised to rival Europe's best. Riders loved its raw power, but Suzuki's experimental rotary rear damper turned the dream into a nightmare. At high speeds, the bike became unstable. Violent tank slappers threw riders without warning. Crashes, lawsuits, and recalls followed. What was meant to be Suzuki's Ducati-killer instead became one of the most feared sports bikes ever sold. So how did a bike built to dominate end up with a reputation for disaster? Let's find out. In the mid-1990s, the superbike world had a king. The Ducati 916 wasn't just fast, it was art in motion. Italian designers had created a motorcycle that looked like it was carved from pure speed. Red bodywork flowed like liquid fire. Twin headlights stared down the road like angry eyes. Even the sound of its L-twin engine was pure music. Every motorcycle magazine put the 916 on its cover. World superbike races turned into Ducati victory parades. Racing fans wrote Ducati shirts and dreamed of owning Italian machinery. But there was a problem. The 916 cost more than most people's cars. In 1997, a new 916 would set you back $13,000. That's about $25,000 in today's money. Even worse, Ducati's build quality was hit or miss. Still, everyone wanted one. The 916 represented everything cool about motorcycles. Style, speed, and European sophistication all rolled into one irresistible package. Honda tried to compete with their VTR1000 Firestorm. It was reliable and smooth like every Honda product, but it looked boring next to the Ducati. Where the 916 was a sculpture, the Honda was an appliance. At Suzuki headquarters in Japan, executives watched this Italian domination with growing frustration. Ducati was a tiny company compared to the Japanese giants, yet they commanded all the prestige in the sports bike market. Suzuki wasn't just another motorcycle company looking for market share. They were engineers who understood power and speed. During World War II, they built aircraft engines. When the war ended, they switched to motorcycles but kept their obsession with performance. The brief from management was crystal clear. Build a bike that looked as good as a Ducati, performed better than a Ducati, and cost half as much. Everything else was negotiable. What happened next would prove that some engineering gambles are too dangerous to take. Inside Suzuki's development labs, the TL1000S project began with pure ambition. The goal wasn't just to compete with Ducati, it was to embarrass them completely. The heart of any great sports bike is its engine, so Suzuki's engineers started with a clean sheet design. They wanted a V-twin like Ducati used, but bigger and more powerful. The result was a 996cc monster that produced 125 horsepower. That was more power than most four-cylinder superbikes of that era. But raw power was only half of the equation. The bike needed to look the part too. Suzuki's designers created something that screamed Italian style with Japanese reliability. They made exposed aluminum framed tubes curved like a sculpture, a half fairing wrapped around the front like a racing windscreen, and three-spoke wheels that looked straight from a Ducati catalog. The TL1000S was stunning. Photos couldn't capture how aggressive it looked in person. This wasn't just another Japanese sports bike, it was a statement piece designed to make Ducati owners question their loyalty. Early prototypes revealed an engine that delivered power like a freight train. Massive torque hit at low RPM, no need to rev to the moon like a four-cylinder, just twist the throttle and feel the bike launch forward like a rocket. Test riders came back grinning and shaking their heads. This thing was brutal in the best possible way. It accelerated harder than anything they'd ridden. The sound was a deep rumble that announced your presence blocks away. It was intoxicating. Marketing teams were already counting profits. A bike this good-looking and powerful would sell itself. Ducati's monopoly on desirable V-twins was about to end. But there was a problem brewing in the engineering department, a problem that would turn Suzuki's dream into a nightmare that haunted riders for decades. The issue was space, or rather lack of it. V-twin engines are longer than inline-four engines, that's just physics. Two cylinders arranged in a V-shape take up more space than four cylinders lined up in a row. For most motorcycles, this isn't a big deal, you just make the bike a bit longer. But Suzuki wanted the TL1000S to handle like a race bike. That meant keeping the wheelbase as short as possible. A longer bike tends to feel sluggish in corners, while a shorter bike changes directions like lightning. The problem was fitting everything into that compact space. The big V-twin engine took up most of the room between the wheels. That left almost no space for the rear suspension. Traditional motorcycle suspension uses a shock absorber mounted vertically behind the engine. Think of it like the shock absorber on a car, but designed for a motorcycle. It controls how the rear wheel moves over bumps and keeps the bike stable under acceleration. But there wasn't any room for a traditional shock on the TL1000S. The massive V-twin engine blocked the usual mounting location. Most companies would have made the bike longer to accommodate proper suspension, not Suzuki. Their engineers had a different idea, a radical idea borrowed from Formula One racing cars. Instead of one shock absorber doing both jobs, they split the functions. The spring went on one side of the bike, the damper went on the other side. But this wasn't just any damper, it was a rotary damper that worked completely differently from anything used on motorcycles before. Picture a traditional shock absorber. It looks like a metal tube with a rod sticking out. As the wheel hits the bumps, the rod moves in and out of the tube. Oil inside the tube controls how fast this happens. Simple and reliable. Now picture the rotary damper Suzuki developed. Instead of a rod moving in and out, rotating arms moved oil around inside a circular chamber. As the rear wheel moved, these arms spun and controlled the damping through rotation instead of linear movement. It sounded brilliant on paper. The rotary system was much more compact than a traditional shock. It freed up space for the big engine while still providing suspension control. Suzuki partnered with Kayaba, one of Japan's top suspension companies, to develop the system. Early testing on smooth roads showed promise. The bike handled well and felt stable, but nobody tested what would happen when things got rough. The rotary damper had a fatal flaw. Under hard use, the oil inside would overheat. Hot oil becomes thin and flows too easily. When that happened, the damper stopped working properly. Imagine driving a car where the shock absorbers suddenly stop working. The car would bounce uncontrollably over every bump. Now imagine that happening on a motorcycle at 100 miles per hour. That's exactly what started happening to TL1000S riders, but the consequences were far more worse than anyone imagined. The first TL1000S motorcycles rolled off the production line in late 1996. Suzuki's marketing department was confident they had a winner. Pre-production reviews were positive. The bike looked incredible in photos. Specifications read like a supercar on two wheels. But as soon as real riders started putting real miles on real roads, problems emerged. The first warning signs came from Suzuki's own test launch in Miami. Even on smooth racetrack, motorcycle journalists noticed the bike felt lively at the front end. That's motorcycle code for unstable. When you accelerate hard on any motorcycle, weight transfers to the rear wheel. This makes the front wheel lighter and can cause it to lift off the ground. That's normal and expected on a powerful bike. But the TL1000S took this to extremes. The combination of massive torque and faulty rear suspension created a perfect storm of instability. Here's how it happened. A rider would accelerate hard out of a corner. A powerful V-twin would deliver huge amounts of torque to the rear wheel. Normally, the rear suspension would control this power and keep the bike stable. But when the rotary damper overheated and stopped working properly, the rear end would start bouncing. This bouncing would transfer through the bike's frame to the front wheel. The front wheel would start to shake violently from side to side. Riders called this a tank slapper because the handlebars would slap against the fuel tank as they oscillated. But that innocent name didn't capture the terror of experiencing one. Picture riding at highway speed when your motorcycle suddenly decides it doesn't want to go straight anymore. The handlebars are ripping at your grip, trying to tear themselves out of your hands. The whole bike is shaking like it's about to fall apart. You're holding on for dear life while traveling at deadly speeds. Most tank slappers last only a few seconds before they either settle down or result in a crash. But those seconds feel like hours when you're living through them. Luke Brackenbury, a professional motorcycle tester, described riding a TL1000S decades later. It doesn't take a lot to get the front end waggling. On a bumpy road, if you're hard on the throttle, then she's twitchy. But in 1997, most riders had never experienced anything like this. The TL1000S delivered tank slappers without warning. Experienced riders found themselves fighting for control on bikes that had been perfectly stable moments before. The crashes started almost immediately. By early 1997, British motorcycle magazines were receiving disturbing reports. TL1000S owners were crashing at alarming rates. These weren't typical motorcycle accidents caused by rider error or bad weather. These were sudden, violent crashes that seemed to come from nowhere. The pattern was always the same. A rider would be traveling at moderate to high speed on a straight road or coming out of a gentle curve. They would accelerate normally, just as they had done thousands of times before on other motorcycles. Then the bike would suddenly become uncontrollable. Tank slappers would develop without warning. The violent shaking would overwhelm even experienced riders. In the best cases, riders managed to slow down and regain control. In the worst cases, the bike would high-side, launching the rider through the air at highway speeds. British motorcycle publications started referring to the TL1000S as the widowmaker. Their nickname stuck like glue. Soon, you couldn't read anything about the TL1000S without seeing those words. The motorcycle press was brutal. Road tests that should have focused on performance instead became warnings about safety. Tank Slapper appeared in every review. Journalists who should have been praising Suzuki's engineering were instead questioning whether the bike should be sold to the public. Real riders shared their experiences in motorcycle forums and magazines. One owner described the rear suspension as feeling floaty and vague. Another said it felt like something was not quite sure what was happening back there. The problem wasn't limited to inexperienced riders. Professional riders and motorcycle journalists experienced the same issues. If people who rode motorcycles for a living couldn't control the TL1000S consistently, what hope did regular riders have? Insurance companies began noticing the pattern too. TL1000S claims were coming in at rates far higher than other motorcycles in the same class. More importantly, the severity of crashes was worse. Tank slappers at high speed tend to result in serious injuries. By the summer of 1997, Suzuki faced a crisis. Their flagship sports bike was earning a reputation as dangerous and unpredictable. Sales were already slowing as word spread through the motorcycle community. Something had to be done quickly, or the TL1000S would become a commercial disaster. Behind closed doors at Suzuki, panic was setting in. The TL1000S was supposed to be their answer to Ducati. Instead, it was becoming a public relations nightmare that threatened to damage the entire Suzuki brand. Internal investigations confirmed what riders were experiencing on the street. The rotary rear damper was failing under real-world conditions. When the oil overheated, damping became inconsistent. This led directly to the handling problems that were causing crashes. Suzuki faced a choice. They could redesign the entire rear suspension system, which would take months and cost millions, or they could find a quick fix that would make the bike safer while they figured out a permanent solution. They chose the quick fix. In late 1997, Suzuki announced a voluntary recall of all TL1000S motorcycles. The solution was embarrassingly simple. They would fit a steering damper to every bike. A steering damper is basically a small shock absorber that mounts between the handlebars and the frame. Its job is to reduce the violent oscillations that cause tank slappers. It's like power steering in reverse. Instead of making steering easier, it makes sudden steering movements more controlled. The recall was free for all TL1000S owners. Suzuki dealers would install the steering damper and perform some engine mapping changes to reduce the bike's tendency to wheelie unexpectedly. From an engineering perspective, the fix worked. Bikes that returned from the recall were much more stable and predictable. The steering damper successfully prevented most tank slappers from developing. But from a marketing perspective, the damage was already done. Suzuki had essentially admitted their flagship sports bike was as dangerous as originally designed. The motorcycle press covered the recall extensively, often with headlines that reinforced the bike's deadly reputation. Even worse, the fix changed how the bike rode. The steering damper made the front end feel heavy and slow to respond. Riders complained the TL1000S no longer felt as agile as it had originally. It was safer, but less exciting. The recall also included engine changes that reduced power in the lower gears. This was supposed to prevent sudden wheelies, but it also reduced the explosive acceleration that made the bike exciting in the first place. Suzuki had saved the TL1000S from being truly dangerous, but they also killed much of what made it special. The TL1000S recall sent shockwaves through the motorcycle industry. Never before had a major manufacturer been forced to admit that one of their flagship bikes was inherently dangerous. Competitors seized the opportunity to attack Suzuki's reputation. Honda's marketing materials began emphasizing the proven reliability of their VTR 1000 Firestorm. Ducati, despite their own reliability issues, positioned themselves as the safe choice for experienced riders who could handle a real sports bike. Motorcycle dealerships reported customer reluctance to consider any Suzuki sports bike. The TL1000S problems cast doubt on the entire company's engineering competence. Sales of other Suzuki models suffered as buyers worried about hidden defects. Insurance companies moved quickly to protect themselves. Premiums for TL1000S coverage jumped dramatically. Some insurers simply refused to write policies for the bike at any price. This created a secondary market problem where bikes became difficult to sell because buyers couldn't get insurance. The specialized motorcycle press, which had initially praised the TL1000S for its power and styling, began questioning their own judgment. How had they missed such fundamental problems during initial testing? The answer was simple. Most motorcycle road tests happen on closed courses or smooth roads under controlled conditions. The rotary damper worked fine under those conditions. It only failed during sustained hard riding on rough pavements, which wasn't part of typical testing protocols. This led to changes in how motorcycles were tested. Publications began including longer-term evaluations and more aggressive real-world testing. The TL1000S had essentially forced the industry to develop better testing standards. Meanwhile, Suzuki's engineering teams were working frantically on a more comprehensive solution. They knew the steering damper was a band-aid, not a cure. The fundamental problem was still there. By 1998, Suzuki had sold approximately 18,000 TL1000S motorcycles worldwide. On paper, that represented decent sales numbers for a niche sports bike, but the real cost of the TL1000S problems went far beyond lost revenue. The company's reputation in the sports bike market was severely damaged. Suzuki had been known for reliable, well-engineered motorcycles that worked as advertised. The TL1000S changed that perception overnight. More importantly, the bike's problems highlighted the dangers of rushing experimental technology to market. The rotary damper might have worked with more development time and testing, but Suzuki's desire to beat Ducati to market led them to release the bike before the suspension system was truly ready. Internal company documents later revealed the extent of the problems. The rotary damper not only overheated, but the mounting points were prone to cracking under stress. Some riders experienced complete suspension failure when the damper mounts broke entirely. Parts availability became another issue. The rotary damper was a bespoke component used only on the TL1000S. When units failed, replacement parts were expensive and often unavailable. Many owners eventually replaced the entire rear suspension system with conventional components. This created a thriving aftermarket industry specifically for TL1000S suspension upgrades. Companies like Orleans and Works Performance offered complete rear shock conversions that eliminated the problematic rotary damper entirely. Riders who made these modifications often reported that their bikes were transformed. With proper rear suspension, the TL1000S became the bike Suzuki had originally intended: stable, fast, and confidence-inspiring. But these modifications cost more than some motorcycles. A complete suspension upgrade would easily cost $2,000 or more. Add in the price of the original bike, and owners were paying Ducati money for Japanese reliability. Suzuki knew they couldn't let the TL1000S disaster define their sports bike program. In 1998, they launched the TL1000R, a fully faired version designed specifically for racing. The TL1000R kept the same basic engine but mounted it in a completely redesigned chassis. Gone was the problematic rotary rear damper, replaced with a conventional shock absorber mounted in a more traditional location. The bike was heavier but much more stable. Professional riders could push it hard without worrying about sudden handling surprises. It looked more aggressive than the naked TL1000S with full bodywork and a racing riding position. Suzuki entered the TL1000R in World Superbike racing, hoping to prove that their V-twin technology could compete with Ducati on the racetrack. The results were mixed. The bike showed promise but never achieved the dominance Suzuki had hoped for. Part of the problem was timing. By 1998, Ducati had moved on to the even more advanced 996, which offered more power and better handling. Honda had also improved their VTR 1000 and developed the more focused RC51 for racing. The TL1000R was a much better motorcycle than the TL1000S, but it arrived too late to change public perception. Riders remained suspicious of Suzuki's V-twin program. Many preferred to wait and see how the bike performed over time rather than risk another TL1000S experience. Sales of the TL1000R were disappointing. The bike was discontinued after just a few years, marking the end of Suzuki's attempt to challenge Ducati in the V-twin sports bike market. The Suzuki TL1000S represents a unique moment in motorcycle history. It was a bike built with the right intentions but crippled by one critical engineering mistake. The rotary rear damper that was supposed to make it special instead made it dangerous. But the bike's problems also taught the industry important lessons about testing and development. No manufacturer today would release a bike with such fundamental stability issues. The TL1000S essentially forced the industry to develop better standards for real-world testing. The bike also demonstrated the importance of getting the fundamentals right before pursuing innovations. Suzuki's desire to be different led them to experiment with unproven technology in a critical system. A more conservative approach to the rear suspension would have produced a much better motorcycle. The TL1000S was never the bike Suzuki intended to build. It was supposed to be a Ducati-killer that would establish Japanese dominance in the V-twin sports bike market. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about the risks of rushing innovation to market. But for riders who understood its limitations and respected its character, the TL1000S could be an incredible machine. It offered raw, unfiltered performance in an era before electronics sanitized the riding experience. The Suzuki TL1000S wasn't killed by its flaws, it was killed by one engineering decision that turned a dream bike into a nightmare. Would you have been skilled enough to tame the original Widowmaker? More importantly, would you have been brave enough to try? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more stories about motorcycles that refuse to follow the rules, hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Thanks for watching.